So happy St. Patrick's Day today. That was a line from one of the great hymns in our hymnal. You may have forgotten what a hymnal is. It's that blue book in front of you there. One of these days, we're gonna go a week without any service bulletins to see if we can be like old school Episcopalians and juggle a hymnal and a prayer book. I know we can do it. Anyway, beautiful line from St. Patrick's breastplate. To begin, actually, I want to begin with what I think is a remarkable story, and it's a story about a Russian family in the 20th century under the horrible and atheistic regime of the Soviet communist Soviet Union. Among the millions of people who were killed during those decades were hundreds of thousands of people killed really in the name of religious persecution. A particular sect that was targeted was a branch of the Russian Orthodox Church, simply known as Old Believers. There was an Old Believer family that was living in a Siberian village, the Lykovs, a father, mother, two children, a son who was 9 and a daughter who was 2 years old. In 1936, a Soviet patrolman saw the father and his brother working in a field and shot at them. And he killed the brother, and the father was not hit and managed to escape. And he grabbed his family with nothing but the shirt on their backs and some prayer books and a Bible, and they fled far, far into the Siberian wilderness. And for decades afterward, this family was simply forgotten, assumed dead. But they retreated more than 100 miles into wilderness that we can scarcely imagine. Dense forests, mountainous terrains, icy bogs, living in, again, social isolation and environmental conditions none of us have ever experienced. They not only lived on, they actually kind of thrived. Had 2 more children were born. They assembled a shaky ramshackle log kennel to live in. When their clothes fell apart, they made new garments from hemp, grown from hemp seed that they were able to collect. When their shoes gave out, they fashioned coverings for their feet from birch bark. They had to grow their own food, obviously, which was limited to potato, hemp, and rye grain. Famine was an ever-present danger. And one June day, in June, it was a freak snowstorm. And the snow killed everything that they had planted to get them through that year. The mother decided to forego her rations, to starve herself in order that her children might have enough food, and she died. But the rest of the family was saved by what they regarded as an absolute miracle. A single grain of rye sprouted unexpectedly. The family built a makeshift fence around the chute and guarded it day and night to keep mice and squirrels away from it. And that fall, at harvest time, that one grain of rye yielded 18 more grains, and the family was slowly able to recreate a crop to sustain their living. One day, years later, 1978, some geologists were skimming the Siberian forest rooftops there and looking for oil and mineral resources, and were astonished to look down and see signs of human habitation, a flourishing garden. After 42 years, the family was discovered 150 miles from the nearest human settlement. It's a true story. A single grain that saves a family destined to death. If you were paying attention to the gospel, you know why I use that story as an illustration today. About 1900 years before the Lykovs family, there were other authorities looking to stamp out a religious sect, the new Jesus movement that was emerging in and around Galilee and Judea and into Jerusalem. All four of the Gospels, as you know, record the events that we will live out next week on Palm Sunday, the triumphal entry of Jesus, the long-awaited King Messiah entering Jerusalem to the large crowds, the palm branches, messianic expectation at a fever pitch. At last he's come. All four of the Gospels share this story. And ironically, again, that's next week, but we are in the immediately following verses today. So we're right after that procession has happened in our gospel reading. And interestingly, the verse just before the gospel reading, where those verses pick up, the preceding verse, the Pharisees are there in the temple because the palm procession is now ended inside the temple in the court of the Gentiles. And they're watching this, and they say, oh my God, the whole world is coming to Jesus, which is just dripping with irony when they say this. As I said, we are at the end of the procession, just inside the temple precincts in what is called the court of the Gentiles. You'll remember just 2 weeks ago, by the way, we were in church and we heard the story about Jesus entering the temple for the first time in John's gospel, recorded, and he cleaned the temple precincts there in the outer court of the Gentiles. Get rid of all of this religious paraphernalia, this commerce that is preventing God's house from being a house of prayer for all people. Get this out of here. And now he's back again for the final Passover. And Jesus is in the same space. And we're told that now among those who went up to worship at the feast were some Greeks. So that prophetic action in chapter 2 is finding its fulfillment. All that's been cleaned out, and we have in the court who's exactly intended to be in that court. Greeks. Now, who are these Greeks? I'm going to make 3 quick points about this. These are not referring to people who are literally from the country of Greece. When you hear this word used in this way in the gospel, this refers to Greco-Roman citizens who are not Jewish, Gentiles, okay? Hellenistic people, but specifically these Hellenists that are being referred to here are people who worship Yahweh, the God of Israel. They're interested. Maybe they're proselytes. They're coming along in confirmation class yet. They haven't yet been baptized. They're not ritual Jews. And they are allowed, indeed encouraged, to worship at the temple in this outer court. They can't go any further, but that's why they are there. It's kind of like exactly who we have in mind with the new service of the door at 5:30 on Sundays. That we want people who may not be ritual Christians, baptized Christians, practicing Christians, but who are nevertheless open to learning more about the God that we worship, and they come in here, and we welcome them. And that gets to the second point I want to make. Again, their presence was always intended. This was not just a Jewish enclave here. The idea was, in fact, from the get-go, from the call of Abraham to the founding of the nation of Israel, that Israel in her relationship to God, that would be so compelling to the rest of the world that the nations would stream to their light. I'm thinking of particularly, say, Isaiah chapter 60. The nations will come to your light. And here we have, again, the fulfillment of that in this text today. Oh, the whole world is coming to Jesus. You believe this? Exactly. And the third point I want to make is now is the time. This is right. This is the time. I'll say more about that in a second. But what we're told in the story is that some of these Gentiles, some of these Greeks, again, they know something about Yahweh. They want to worship Yahweh. They've heard about Jesus. They couldn't have missed the spectacle around his entry. And they ask for a personal appointment. And they go to Philip. Sir, we wish to see Jesus. What a wonderful thing to say. Wouldn't it be great if we all woke up on Sundays? I wish to see Jesus, and I know where to go. They go to his disciples. They go specifically to Philip. Why is this? This is maybe a little bit of trivia. John's gospel, and John alone, tells us that 25% of the disciples, Philip, Peter, and his brother Andrew, were from the town of Bethsaida. It says in Galilee, but technically it was not really a part of Galilee. It was a Greco-Roman city, really a large town east of the Jordan River, north of the Sea of Galilee. And if that's where Philip and Peter and Andrew grew up, they grew up in a town where they were a minority as Jews. Most of the people in their town would have been Greek-speaking Gentiles, so they were bilingual, which is why these Greeks, who must recognize something in Philip as a fellow Greek speaker, talk to him. Sir, we wish to see Jesus. And they are led to him, or so we assume, and Jesus responds to this request in sort of a typically indirect manner. He often does this. He speaks figuratively. What does he say? He says, unless a grain of wheat falls into the earth and dies, it remains alone. But if it dies, it bears much fruit. Come again? I've been thinking about this all week. What does he mean here? The seed of God implanted in the Virgin Mary, who comes to us in the birth of Jesus of Nazareth. The seed of God that through the cross of Jesus is sown in a tomb, and it will birth everlasting life, a harvest forever for all. What has to happen to the embryo inside this seed for it to be fertilized? Where the outer husk or seed covering has to break down, it has to die. And that happens when it's sown in death. And of course, we can't help remembering, if you read carefully John's gospel, that earlier before this story, Jesus has referred to himself as the bread of life who will feed all people. Everyone will be nourished forever on this bread of life, this single grain of wheat. And so, my friends, I want to say that if there's a takeaway, we're supposed to have a takeaway. Well, I don't know. The invitation for us this morning is to live this pattern with Jesus. If we are to enter into his glory, the glory as of our Father's only Son, letting the seeds that we carry around go, that bear no life, bear no fruit, just let them die. We carry around a lot of seeds that we have not sown, that we have not let die. What do I mean? It's a familiar list. Our angers and disappointments and resentments, our holding on to grudges, cycling back through over and over and over again our mistakes, lack of forgiveness of other people, the seeds of professional and social ambition, nothing wrong with them in and of themselves, but if that's where we think we're going to find our ultimate joy, we are so sadly mistaken, as we see over and over again. If I could just confess to you, I'm almost embarrassed at how often the Lord catches me up about my holding on to a seed of some kind of like professional religious success. You know, coming on Monday morning, how many people came to church yesterday? It's like, let that seed die. It's not your work, it's my work. When we lived in Nashville, we had a larger piece of real estate where our home was. We had about 1.5 acres, but it was on a hill. And I was constantly fighting the issue of erosion. I loved to do yard work back then. Back in the day, I was a little younger, a little more energetic. I would spend many hours on my day off doing yard work, loved it. I didn't know really what I was doing, but I did know how to seed my lawn with fescue, and I would wear these sort of brownish, yellowish brown canvas pants to work in. And one early spring, I put those pants back on for the first time since the previous fall, and I put them on and I stuck my hand in my pocket and I pulled out this whole handful of grass seed. Of course, it had not done a thing while it was in my pants. But I went out in the yard and it was starting to come back in. The seed that had fallen into the ground and died was showing new life. What is the seed you're carrying around in your pants? And it ain't gonna grow. There's a lot of that. There's a lot of that in my life. And Jesus said, unless a grain of wheat falls into the earth and dies, it remains alone. But if it dies, it bears much fruit. Well, we can try, and I have tried and tried. But at the end of the day, I cannot do it. I cannot do it absent God's grace and God's power to let those seeds that never die, that never bear any fruit, truly to let them go. I think it was Andrew Murray, 19th century Scottish preacher, who said something like, self can never cast out self. Our self is in the way of this full life of richness with God, and we can't get rid of the self. Self can never cast out self. We have to ask God to do it for us. And this is the spiritual opportunity that we have today, to pray yet again. Because we can't do the work doesn't mean the work hasn't been done and can't be done wherever you are today, because Jesus is the seed. He's the one seed. He's the one and only necessary seed who has died and who bears fruit. And not just for you and for me, but for the whole world. We do want to see Jesus. That's why we're here. And Jesus says, when I am lifted up, I will draw all people to myself. That's where we see him. When he is lifted up, the time has come. Now is the time. Jesus has said before this in John's gospel, my time is not yet, but now it is. He has arrived for the final Passover, and all the people are coming into his midst. The glory of God, and the outpouring of love through the obedience and the submission of Jesus to the cross for your sake, for my sake, and for the sake of the world. He is the one seed, the one grain. Amen.